39 years ago, I guess it's been, Jerry Cohen entered my life. Like only a few students before me, and it's because I am that old, even though I don't look it, and many students after me, he changed my life. He always says, in Confucian tradition, as my teacher, he educated me, he found me my first job, and he failed to find me a spouse. Seriously, without Jerry, hundreds, one would say thousands of people from judges to academics, from presidents to heads of NGOs, from practitioners to presidents of large corporations would not have had their life affected in the way that it was. Jerry's students are all over the globe today, and I think it's fair to say they carry with them the wisdom, the passion, and the values that Jerry instilled in them and us. And for that, we thank you and are forever in your debt. One of my colleagues at Carlisle used to be fond of saying, when we were briefing students, associates in the beginning of their career, he would always say, he was a lawyer and I was a lawyer, and he would say, if Steve and I were the best lawyers in the country, we wouldn't be here today. Now, Jerry Cohen, of course, in 1960 had what you would call the platinum track in law. He'd been editor of the Yale Law Journal. He had been clerks to two storied Supreme Court justices, Earl Warren and Felix Frankfurter. He had worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., the most prestigious U.S. Attorney's Office in the United States, and he was a professor at the University of California at Berkeley Law School. So why did you deviate from that platinum track where you could have become a Supreme Court justice or virtually anything else you wanted to be, to start studying Chinese law, with China just having emerged from the Great Leap Forward and 6 years from entering the Cultural Revolution?
Well, my friends who were charitable at that time, hearing what I was going to do, said he must be having a nervous breakdown. Why would you throw away a promising career on a country we couldn't even go to, and where relations with America were so bad that, I'll give you two examples. When JFK was going down Pennsylvania Avenue with President Eisenhower, to the inauguration in '61, Eisenhower supposedly said to him, "There's only one thing that will bring me out of retirement, and that's if you move to recognize Red China," as they called it then. And in the 1960 November elections, 3 of the 4 members of Congress who had voted to bring the PRC into the General Assembly, not the Security Council of the UN, were defeated in the fall election. There was a lot of hostile feeling toward China. And of course, we couldn't go there. And 2 years earlier, when the dean of UCLA Law School, who was trying to recruit me for their faculty, gave a party, he said to me, out of nowhere, "Somebody ought to study the law of Red China." And I said, without a moment's reflection, obviously, "That's the zaniest idea I've ever had." And 2 years later, I took the plunge. That's hard to account for it. And I owe it all to 2 things: the Korean War and the South African human rights movement. Now, I see Doug Murray puzzling how to connect these two, and I don't blame him. In 1959, a law professor from South Africa Cape Town, Dennis Cowan, went on a barnstorming tour of the United States to try to alert us to the human rights abuses of the South African regime. He made a deep impression on a man at Berkeley, Frank Newman, who was about to become our dean. Frank Newman went to his erstwhile law school classmate, then president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Dean Rusk. This was April '60. He said, "Give us a chair in African law." And Dean Rusk said, "Oh, Africa is very important, but by the way, who knows anything about China and law?" Newman came back and reported that to me, and since I was preparing for my next day's classes, I paid no attention whatever, but Dean Rusk paid attention. And 3 months later, he called up and he said to Bob Scalapino, a noted founder of this organization, Bob was teaching, of course, at Berkeley, he said, "Does the law school want to teach somebody not about Africa, but about China so they could educate future generations?" Now, that was interesting. Why did Rusk do that? He did that because during the Korean War, after our troops pushed the North Koreans back into North Korea, we were confronted with a fateful decision. Should we pursue them into North Korea? Similar to the decision George H.W. Bush had to take about Iraq. And George H.W. Bush, perhaps because of the earlier example, made the right decision from my point of view, but we didn't, even though the Chinese were telling us via the Indian ambassador Panikkar in Beijing that if America sends its troops into North Korea, we will be compelled to enter the war. And there were people in Washington who said, China's serious. But the majority view was, those ragtag commies, are they going to take on the world's greatest power? Nonsense. And you see what happened. Now, Rusk wasn't stupid. He had been Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at that time. He witnessed the whole thing. And he knew we didn't know enough about China. And when he became president of Rockefeller in '53, he decided to help Ford and other institutions train a new generation of people who might understand China better. And they helped political scientists, sociologists, economists, historians, literary people, everybody but people in law. And when my dean-to-be walked into his office and said, "Give us a chair in African law," something clicked. And I became the beneficiary. How? Because I was a new boy on the faculty. And when Russ called up and said, "Find somebody to undertake this task," the new dean said to me, "I can tell you what to do, you're just a kid. Find me somebody. Find me an East German who studied law in Beijing. Find me an economist who knows Chinese and is willing to go to law school. Find me a Chinese who's just finished law school and our faculty will be willing to find me somebody." And I tried all of the above. I failed miserably. And finally, somebody said to me, "You know, Confucius said, establish yourself at 30. So I'm sure early." And I'm not kidding. I had just had my 30th birthday. And I thought, you got to go with fate in life. If you're going to give up a lucrative law practice in Covington and Burling or places like that to go into academic life, do something you can't do as a lawyer. Don't teach labor law or tax law or do things I could have done part-time while making money. Be a pioneer. Do something totally irrational. So that's how it happened.
Do you ever regret not being a Supreme Court judge?
No. I had 2 years there, and of course, it might have been nice. My father was a small-town lawyer. He wanted to be a judge. He loved litigation. He loved going to court. And on his deathbed, he said, "If I can't go back to court, I don't want to live." It sounds irrational. And he had no idea the impact it had on his children, auditors. But he loved court, and he never got to be a judge because he was a Republican city attorney of our small town, Linden, New Jersey, not far from here, and he got swept out in '32 by the Democratic sweep under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he never recovered. Local Republican politics never recovered in his lifetime. So he never became a judge. And although I loved the 2 years at the Supreme Court, I was more interested in international affairs. I went to high school during World War II. My high school graduation speech was entitled, "Youth Looks Ahead to a Richer and Fuller Life." And it was all about, it sounded like the English poet, "I looked into the future far as human eye could see and had a vision of the world and all the wonders that would be." I was going to save the world. We were UN kids in the late 40s. So being a Supreme Court judge seemed pretty tame stuff if you're going to save the world.
You could argue, as has been proved.
I wish it were.
Now, you have met with some of the great leaders of China from the 20th century. You've met with Zhou Enlai, you've met with Deng Xiaoping, you've met with Chiang Kai-shek. And when they were meeting with you, they knew you were the leading American expert on law in China. Did they demonstrate a understanding of the importance of rule of law in their societies?
Zhou Enlai was, of course, the most charming of them. And you know, it's remarkable. I had, on June 16th, 1972, a 4-hour meeting with Zhou Enlai. Sitting closer to him than Steve and I, John Fairbank was on the other side, and we teamed up on him trying to brainwash him into sending people to Harvard. I was then teaching at Harvard. And Zhou Enlai was a considerable figure. He knew every guest's background. He had to have dinner and lunch every day with foreigners. It was dreadfully boring work, I'm sure. And he decided he wouldn't waste a moment, so he picked their brains. And he constantly asked you questions all the time. And he said to me, remember, this is June '72, before China got serious about a formal legal system. The Cultural Revolution was still on. And Zhou Enlai said to me with a kind of bemused look that everyone at the table, including Harrison Salisbury from the New York Times, understood. He said, "I understand you've done many books about Chinese law," obviously implying I had made more of Chinese law than China had. He was a clever guy. But now, Chiang Kai-shek couldn't have cared less. That was in 1968. I had just been asked by the American Council of Learned Societies and the Social Sciences Research Council to join a 3-person academic mission to Taiwan. I was the law person, George Taylor from Seattle, very conservative, supporter of Chiang Kai-shek. He was the political scientist, and Martin Wilbur, a very good historian at Columbia, who was understandably a Kuomintang supporter, the 3 of us. The only problem was I was denied a visa. They thought I was going to see Peng Ming-min, the recently released from prison former law professor who was a Taiwan independence supporter, and they'd been tuning in on my telephone conversations. Fox Butterfield, the then New York Times stringer, wanted to get us together with Peng Ming-min, and I got denied a visa. Fortunately, a student of mine at Harvard Law School was the son of a famous advisor to the Generalissimo, Mr. Tao Shisheng, a philosopher, a politician, writer. He called up his father, and he was outraged. His professor had been denied a visa, and without knowing anything about me, Tao Shisheng guaranteed my good behavior to the Generalissimo, and they reversed that decision. The only thing is, Mr. Tao began to get nervous, and he sent my former student, John Wei Ren, a brilliant young historian at that time, to the airport to tell me I mustn't see Peng Ming-min, whatever. Well, a day and a half later, having been denied a visa the previous week, I was sitting there with Martin Wilbur and George Taylor and Madame Zhang and Chibo, just 5 of us. And of course, in the presence of Westerners, especially Americans, he didn't do too much talking. She did all the talking. And she was a very smart, of course, and charming person who kept the conversation going. But I was prepared because I had been told by the Americans who were our diplomats then, Taipei, President Chiang Kai-shek always asks visitors, how can we improve? How can we improve our society? And my student, Zhang Weiren, aspiring legal historian, couldn't get a job when he went back to Taiwan after years at Harvard preparing, because Chinese legal history was not considered very exciting. Well, when the president asked me, he said, how can we improve ourselves? I had an enormous temptation to shout, freedom! But my practical side overwhelmed me. And I said, you know, Mr. President, you're always talking about how Taiwan is the true repository of Confucian traditional Chinese culture compared to those bandits on the mainland who were going through the Cultural Revolution at its worst moment, of course. And they said, and yet you've got thousands of volumes of Qing Dynasty documents rotting in your basement. Somebody has to take them, organize them, and really do something with them. And I have just the right person for you. Now, if I had said freedom, I would have had a one-way ticket back to the airport. But instead, Zhang Weiren got a wonderful job at Academia Sinica. And the next visit, I saw he was running a factory with an assembly line, taking these books, drying them out, reprinting them, writing about them. It was a fantastic thing, and he's become a great historian. So Chiang Kai-shek did a lot for Chinese legal history, even though that may not have been his intent. Now, Deng Xiaoping, really, he wasn't interested or even aware, I think, that I was there, because I went, this was the last day, perhaps, of 1977. I was there with Ted Kennedy. I had worked with Ted Kennedy from 1966. In the late 60s, the Democrats took the lead in arguing for a new China policy. And Ted Kennedy, and shortly after, George McGovern, began to beat the drums for China. But of course, Nixon and Kissinger had a much bigger 1972 election extravaganza in mind. And in fact, Jim Thompson and I had been the ones to recommend to Henry that he tell the president that they should have a secret meeting with China. So ironically, even though I was a Democrat and I disliked Nixon intensely, the fact was he took our idea, fortunately, sent Henry over there, and the Democrats had to sit home. One thing the Republicans made clear to the Chinese, you're not going to let Teddy Kennedy or any Democratic candidate get to China before the Republicans did. So politics was very much involved at that time. Kennedy had to wait until late 77. I escorted 11 Kennedy family people to China at that time. And Kennedy said to me, quite seriously, I'm going to regard this trip as a failure if we don't get to meet Deng Xiaoping. Because in late 77, it was obvious Deng was making a comeback, and everybody wanted to meet him. But we had two problems. One was when we were there, Deng had the flu and was feeling very bad. The other problem was Kennedy was the first of 100 American senators who would want to meet Deng Xiaoping. And Deng was worried, if you meet one, you got to meet them all. Well, we had to put on a campaign, both by telephone to America, where my patient wife would listen to me very loud and clear, tell the people listening in to our conversation what a dreadful impact this was going to have on America's earliest and most important supporter of a new China policy on the Democratic side if we didn't get to meet Deng Xiaoping. And we'd have meetings in Ted's main living room of his suite where we would talk in loud tones about what a stupid thing this would be if they don't let us meet Deng Xiaoping. And finally it worked. And we had a wonderful hour and a half, but the only trouble was Deng was ill, and he liked to chew tobacco. Now normally when he wasn't ill, the foreign ministry people had persuaded him every time he wanted to expectorate, he should get up and leave the room, not use the spittoon at his feet. But since he was weakened and tired, he didn't resort to that technique. He used the spittoon, which was between him and Ted Kennedy. And I was seated right behind them. So I were the interpreter, but fortunately I didn't have to be. I found Deng's Mandarin Sichuan style was pretty hard to detect on some occasions. But we had expected we'd all have a group photograph with the 11 Kennedy kids, including Caroline, etc. And Patrick was there, of course, and the older Ted Jr. I had not prepared the kids for meeting Deng Xiaoping except for a handshake and a photo. We were told then he would dismiss the kids and we'd have a serious talk. But Deng liked the kids so much, he said, everybody should stay for the talk. Well, they were not prepared for Deng's use of the spittoon. And when he started to use the spittoon, I thought Patrick Kennedy, then 13 years old, would just break up audibly. And I looked at that kid with dragon eyes. I mean, here we've been waiting 11 years for kids. And were these kids going to screw it up? Fortunately, they behaved very, very well. But Deng really didn't know anything about me, or he cared about law. We learned a year or two later by recognizing its relevance to China's modernization. And I was very excited when I read the Renminbi Bao in December '78, because he not only called for economic reform, but he saw the relevance of law to that reform. And at that time, Owen Lee and I were in Hong Kong, associated with the late lamented Couder brothers. And Owen is too modest because he'd already been practicing law for some years. I was coming out of Harvard being an academic. The only thing I knew about law practice I had done, I'd been a prosecutor in Washington and worked at Covington and Burling, but I knew nothing about foreign investment law. I mean, he knew what a joint venture was. So he was a very valuable person. And beginning February '79, we started our contact with China with the taxation authorities and then spread to the foreign investment authorities. So it's wonderful, Owen, that we could all coincide here, because Owen, Steve, and I actually put on a course in 1979-80 and 80-81. We were all with Couder brothers. We had the opportunity to set up the first law office in China at that time. There were no Chinese law offices in 1979. They had not yet been restored after the Cultural Revolution. And we had this de facto, not fully registered law office. And the way we got it was by promising to train the economic officials of Beijing for the city of Beijing through our beloved host, Xiaoyang, who later became the chief of Sichuan province, and before that party secretary of Chongqing. So it's quite a wonderful coincidence that the three of us should all be in the same place at the same time. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
It was actually my next question was going to be about how, after the meeting with Deng a few years later, you were able to set up the first law firm. But that probably wouldn't, the spittoon and Ted Kennedy wouldn't qualify as your most difficult moment in China in the 40 years. What would be your most difficult moment?
Well, that's interesting. When we went to Beijing in February '79 to be hosted by the Ministry of Finance, they gave us a very warm reception at the old Peking airport. We approached the line where we were going to go through immigration. There was a huge line of mostly Chinese people waiting, but they took us to a special line where we wouldn't have to wait. They just ushered us through. And from the back of the main line, a Chinese gentleman, crew cut, about 60 years of age, he saw this special treatment for foreigners, and he said, "Bugong Tamanhingai Paitway." It's unfair. They ought to stand in line too. And I was thrilled on one hand and embarrassed on the other hand. Thrilled because for 20 years or more we've been separated from China. We didn't know under the new communist revolution, were we sharing common values, especially with respect to ideas like equal justice under law, equality. And here this fellow shouts out equal treatment for foreigners and Chinese. I was happy, but I was so embarrassed. Why me? Why did he have to pick me out? And so that was an early thing. Can you think of really difficult experiences we had in China? We had some very up and down negotiations. We had some wonderfully humorous events. You know, one of the questions we had during the 20 years of our separation from China was, had communism destroyed the traditional wonderful Chinese sense of humor? But lo and behold, when we had a chance for contacts through negotiations, we discovered, on the contrary, communism had provided a sense of humor with a lot of new material. And I'll never forget a negotiation in Guangzhou. Must have been early '80 maybe. We were going to build an office apartment building complex, $80 million investment. And the Chinese wanted us to take all the risk. And I thought that was unreasonable. I said to the man across the table, "You want us to take all the risk?" And with a twinkle in his eye, he said, "Capitalists take risks. We're socialists." You know, the first 12 years I studied about China, I couldn't go there. It was like studying the moon or studying Roman law. We were not allowed to go to the promised land. And if you wait 12 years, and once you have that opportunity, you never lose the zest for human contact that you've been denied so long. And I loved negotiation. Steve and Owen know, you walk into a room, there are 10 to 20 people on the other side of the table. They're more anxious than you are because they hear some big deal New York lawyers are coming, or some Harvard law professor. They've never done a joint venture before. They think we're about to pull the wool over their eyes. And you have to win their confidence. You have to show them you know something about their legal system and they can trust you. And that was a challenge. I see Yvonne Chan there. She's been through it often. Also when we worked for Paul Weiss together. And I never got over it. The human contact, if human contact matters to you as it does to most of us, it was extremely gratifying.
What about your, when you look back at this extraordinary career, what would you say was your greatest accomplishment then?
Gosh, recruiting Steve Orleans for Harvard Law School.
That's what my next question was going to be. Well, you can answer that question. My next question was going to be, what would you want to do differently besides making sure that Steve Orleans didn't go to Harvard Law School?
I must tell you, a few of my gang from NYU, we have something called the U.S. Asia Law Institute. We're doing what we hope will be significant work. And we approached the subway at Astor Place. And just as we get to the subway, whom do I see there but Sandy Rant? Clark Rant, our 7.5-year recently retired ambassador to China, a former student from 1973-74. I gave him a fellowship to go to China for the first time and do something about law and foreign trade. And he was just on the street corner going to see his son, Clark Jr., who's a student at NYU. And I said, Sandy, you've really got to come to this meeting. And he said he couldn't. He has got a commitment to his son, and of course, that is a superior claim. But he noted I was wearing a bow tie. Now, until he became ambassador, a bow tie was our most common trait. He was a much better tennis player than I was, but I tried to match him in bow ties with my wife's assistance. And for my birthday every year, Sandy would give me a bow tie. And he would always wear one until the day before he went before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to approve his ambassadorial appointment. We had dinner that night, and he broke the news to me. He said, "Tomorrow when I go up on the Hill, I'm not wearing a bow tie." And I said, "You know, just for a political appointment, you're willing to break the faith?" He said, "My White House handlers tell me the American people do not have confidence in people who wear bow ties."
So are you saying your greatest accomplishment was getting Sandy to not wear bow ties?
I'm saying now he's prepared to go back to the true faith. Accomplishments, it's hard to say. My greatest accomplishment, if you're lucky enough to live as long as I have, is the people I have invested time in. When I started teaching, the retiring dean at Berkeley was a famous scholar of law named William L. Prosser. I see Judge Sidney Stein in the back. He's old enough to remember Prosser on torts, which was the leading horn book, as we called it. And Prosser, who was a person I sometimes disagreed with, but nevertheless he was a wise old guy. And he said, you know, if you go into teaching, you have to live at least 10 years to begin to see the works of your students. Well, I've had 50, over 50 now. And that really is the greatest satisfaction, to see what these people have become, not only in America, but in other countries. And of course, prominent among the places my students have been active is Taiwan. I have a wonderful time when I go to Taiwan, and I have an opportunity to influence opinion, for better or worse. Liu Sholian, Annette Liu, was my student. She was vice president for 8 years, the first woman to have such an office. Ma Ying-jeou, the president, was my student. His wife was my research assistant, as some of you know. The head of the court system was Sifai Yuen. Ma Ying-jeou was also one of our Harvard doctoral students. This is an extraordinary thing. In the mainland, we keep waiting for people with legal training and outlook to rise to prominence. In Taiwan, some people think they have too many lawyers running the government there. I'm not among those who think that. But that's an immense satisfaction to see what people do. And when I stopped teaching about doing business with China at NYU, I gave up a course of 118 students. I had to think, who among next year's group that didn't make the cut in my seminar of only 28 am I excluding? But you have to be practical at some point. But it's the people and their accomplishments. And I still remember the day I heard from Steve in the fall of '71. The late Jim Thompson would occasionally send me outstanding talent, and it's a wonderful thing.
So that doesn't count as one of the things you would do differently. Is there anything that you would do different if you had to do it all over again? What would you do differently?
You know, that reminds me of the joke about the 3 women who were...
Judge Stein, can we direct the witness to answer the question?
Cindy, do you know that story about the 3 women who were comparing notes about whether they should have children again if they had to do it all over again? And finally they turned to one woman who had 4 children, and she thought a long time as they said, well, would you have children again? And she said, of course I would, but not the same one. Maybe there.
What did it feel like when you were actually, your relationship to one of your students was an issue in the campaign for president of Taiwan? You know, his role at Harvard and what he had done, and he was elected.
Ma Ying-jeou, whatever you think about his policies, etc., and I'm generally for them, is a highly intelligent person, but many politicians are intelligent. He's very articulate, unusually good at English, but more distinctively for a politician, as far as we can tell, he's totally clean. He has avoided personal social entanglements. He has avoided corruption. He's a tough candidate to run against. And every time he comes up for election, they drag out the same old stuff. When he ran for mayor of Taipei, the DPP people, some of whom, as they say, are my best friends, they would say, when he was at Harvard Law School in the late 70s, early 80s, he was a paid Kuomintang spy. And Professor Cohen can prove it. Well, then of course the press calls me up, and I say, how can I prove it? You know, although Annette Lu used to come to see me once a week and say, you got to throw that guy out of school, I'd say, on what basis? She never claimed he was a paid spy for the Kuomintang. She just said, he's reporting everything I say, I'm sure. I said, look, America's a free country. You're free to say what you want. Other people are free to report what you say. I can't. But nobody said he was a paid agent of the Kuomintang. I've never had it. And so I have said that in public. Ma got elected mayor of Taipei. He was very grateful to me for making the statement to the press. Sure enough, it came up again when he's running for the presidency. And that's kind of pathetic. You're running for the presidency in 2008, and they try to drag up against you something that happened, if it ever did, 1978, 79, 30 years earlier. It's nonsense. But so to that modest extent, I have played a role in the election, and it's cost me the friendship of one or two of my former proteges of the DPP persuasion, but fortunately a number of others are still willing to talk to me.
Let's move to the more recent past in your work on human rights in China. And I think it's fair to characterize your position these days as saying in the who-when era, we have seen little progress on rule of law. In fact, we probably have seen some backsliding. So my question, though, is not really about the last few years, but when we are all together celebrating your 90th birthday, what are you going to say about the rule of law in China? I mean, when you look out and we see this growing middle class, we see rhetoric that seems to be moving in the direction of more rule of law, of the creation of an independent judiciary, of a more open media, even though we're not seeing progress. Do you see the right trajectory so that when we do this interview on your 90th birthday, you'll say it's better or no?
Well, I'm an optimist. If I had been a pessimist, I would have studied Soviet law. I love China. I love Chinese people. I have enormous confidence in them. And if you go back and compare the China of 1978, not to mention when we first got there in 72, with the China of today, you see this fabulous progress, enormous progress. I mean, you could say the gap between rich and poor is getting out of hand, and there are all kinds of caveats one can make. But how can you not feel the general trajectory of China is right? But it doesn't mean there can't be some serious bumps along the road in the next 10 years. And that relates to the legal system, I feel. I feel there has been retrogression. I do feel that although we can point to enormous change in the legal system, when we first started, you, Roland, and I, and others, to deal with China, there really was no law to speak of. Owen and I wrote 3 articles about the cooperative ventures in China before there was a cooperative venture law. We were making a kind of forecast based on our knowledge out of Hong Kong. You didn't have law, you didn't have relevant bilateral, multilateral treaties, you didn't have trained judges. The legal profession had been dead for over 20 years. The Ministry of Justice had been eliminated. You had nothing. Then 30 years later, you have an entirely different situation from the point of view of personnel. There was no legal education in China when we first went there. I wrote an article in 1973 for the Harvard Law School Bulletin about my recent trip. I started out by saying the first thing you have to understand about legal education in China is that there isn't any. And now you have over 625 law schools and law departments. You have a huge number of people studying law. Several 100,000 people take the bar exam every year. 165,000 judges, maybe, same number, no, 200,000 judges, about 165,000 lawyers, roughly the same number of prosecutors. You have every legal agency has a legal department staffed by people who study law. Every factory of any significance, any economic unit, the legislature of the country and the provinces and the cities all have legal advisors. You have, in other words, an overlapping series of new legally sensitive elites. Even in the police, some of the best graduate students I met in China were at the Public Security University in Beijing. And these are people who want to invest their lives with meaning. And they have made quite a lot of progress. And we tend to focus, given our preoccupation with civil and political rights, on those aspects of the rule of law. But if you think about the rule of law with respect to bankruptcy or taxation or intellectual property, I'm not so sure you could say the trend has been adverse in China. Maybe not huge progress in the last few years, but China has done pretty well, especially after getting into the WTO and having that as an enormous stimulus. But when it comes to the rights of people against the state, the protection against arbitrary action, that's the weakest link in China's progress, of course. And will there be further progress? We were just talking coming up in the subway about, we hope within the next 3 years, finally the criminal procedure law of 1996, which badly needs revision, will receive those amendments, etc. We don't know. I think everybody's waiting until 2012, the 18th Party Congress, the hope that a new generation will take over, not just good technocrats like you have now, but people, leaders at the top, who are increasingly sensitive to legal considerations. In the Chinese communist system, like the Soviet system, you need support not only from the bottom, bubbling up, which China has to a great extent, that's the hope of China, but you need somebody in the leadership who sees the relevance of the improvement of legal institutions to the country's peace, stability, and harmony. We went through this with General Park in South Korea and with Chiang Kai-shek and his successors in Taiwan. Finally, Jiang Jingguo, Chiang Kai-shek's son, in his dying days as president, he knew you had to stop repression at some point and start recognizing the new demands for social progress, for political progress, and provide the institutions gradually to channel that into a more harmonious outlet. And South Korea at the same time went through a similar process. Now, we didn't know in 1956 that Khrushchev, who'd been one of Stalin's running dogs, punching bags, when he took over the party, he would want de-Stalinization to occur. You don't know what a man will do until he's at the top in a communist system. And I say a man because we haven't yet had any women, unlike other places in Asia, as leaders. And nobody knew what Gorbachev would do, even though he'd been to law school, until he got to the top. You don't get to the top by touting human rights or legal institutional reform. So I don't know whether we will see China's future vindicate at what Alexander Pope wrote about hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is but always to be blessed. I remember what Kissinger used to joke about Brazil. He said, Brazil is the land of the future and always will be. Well, maybe those of us who invest our lives in things like the rule of law in China are destined to be disappointed, but I think progress will be made. Chinese people are increasingly sophisticated, and the demand is growing, not among the Xieja, the entrepreneurs of China. That's different from French history, for example. It's not the rising bourgeoisie in China who are demanding law reforms, but it's the déracinés, the uprooted, the people who are in the lower classes who haven't benefited much from this fantastic economic development. Nevertheless, they're getting exposed more and more to rights consciousness, even induced by the leadership who keep talking about the constitutional amendments for human rights and property rights and all that. The leadership is creating its own demand among the masses for following rules, being less arbitrary. So I think it's going to happen. It may not happen before my 90th birthday, but let's see.
Do you think that the fact that the leadership now is a consensus leadership actually works against having rule of law? Having real progress in these areas?
It works against change generally because consensus requires a lot of persuasion, and usually you have to settle for the least common denominator. Whereas Deng Xiaoping and certainly Mao, whatever their view, were capable of putting that view over. Deng did some remarkable things. Unfortunately, he was a visionary about the economy. He was even a visionary about Hong Kong, with a brilliant solution to that problem. But Deng was no visionary when it came to civil and political rights. Deng presided over the anti-rightist movement in 1957 to 59 as the party's Secretary General, and Deng was the guy who gave the order for June 4th and afterward. So one can't expect too much. I'm impressed by Zhang Jinghua in Taiwan because he was a killer. He was the head of the Taiwan secret police when we first went to Taiwan in the 1960s. And yet by the middle 80s, he set in motion forces that have led to peaceful change. And of course, peaceful except occasionally in the Taiwan legislature. But you can't have everything. These people are doing a terrific job in struggling to show a Chinese political legal culture is capable of establishing the rule of law in terms that we can understand. Of course it has their distinctive brand, but it has been a clear application of the German Constitutional Court in Taiwan and many aspects of the American political system. I don't say that makes it right, but they are engaging in a fabulously important process, just as South Korea has been. And I think that offers hope. The mainland is much more challenging, of course. It's a huge place. Just to govern successfully a place that size is such a huge challenge. But I think progress will be made. Maybe there won't be political democracy Western style, but something unique is developing. But certainly the Chinese government has no excuse for failing to improve the administration of criminal justice and the protections of individuals. They can't use culture as a defense.
What do you think about this Obama administration's policy in this area? What should they be doing differently, if anything?
Well, I got a call just this afternoon as they're preparing in the State Department for a resumption of the human rights dialogue. We have these dialogues spasmodically on two levels. One, a general human rights dialogue between the two governments, and two, more occasionally, a dialogue between experts on both sides. And we hope that next month there will be the first type of dialogue. They're just debating what kinds of issues should be covered and what expectations should be, and maybe that first dialogue will then set in motion progress toward the experts dialogue. I personally don't put too much stock in these discussions. I often feel it's a kind of babysitting operation that the Chinese government feels it has to go through just to throw a bone to the foreign governments who have to show their people we really care about human rights in China. They prefer in these discussions, as Chinese leaders generally do, to talk principles. But I like to talk cases, practice, because you can have beautiful principles, but what we find is the reality on the ground, and we can cite chapters. On Thursday, 2 lawyers from Beijing will be at a hearing before the Beijing Judicial Bureau, which wants to take away their lawyer's license because they were protesting the way they've been treated in a provincial court when they were defending Falun Gong people. This goes on all the time. The repression of the legal profession, to the extent they get involved in human rights movement, is one of the key questions. Another related to it is the repression of NGOs and public interest, not only law firms, but activist groups generally. I think this is a big mistake. The regime should be confident enough to be recruiting these people and exploiting them and making use of them. And they're too fearful of any sign of dissent. And I suppose they have in mind, of course, what happened in the Soviet Union, East Germany, etc., but also June 4th. But I am a great believer in institutional reform. If your petition system is a joke, a sad joke, if your legal system is too frustrating for people, if you have no other outlet but going into the streets for protest, then you ought to develop better institutions to give people more of an outlet. It seems to be quite logical. It's going to happen eventually, but I'm not holding my breath.
Jan is urging me to open the floor to a few questions in the remaining minutes, though I'm happy to continue on with questions. Is there anybody who would like?
By the way, I should say, contrary to the rumors set forth by this illustrious organization to which I have belonged since the mid-60s, today is not my birthday.
It's a celebration of your birthday.
Yes.
It's not your birthday.
Some of you know it's easy to remember my birthday because my birthday is the birthday of the Chinese Communist Party. July 1st. 7月1号. But I hasten to point out the party is older than I am.
I thought when you were going to answer the question about why you went into it in the first place in 1960, it was because your birthday was the birthday of the Chinese Communist Party.
That would have been a reinterpretation of history. I was so ignorant.
You didn't know at that point.
I didn't know it.
Are there questions? If not, in fact, speaking of the National Committee, when did you first start dealing with the National Committee? That's the first part of the question.
I was not among the illustrious founders. Bob Scalapino, Alex Eckstein, Lucian Pye, Doak Barnett, these were great figures. I was a Johnny-come-lately. These people knew a huge amount about China, and they started this organization. I came on a couple of years later, and it's an amazing experience to sit here today with you because I was used to being the only kid in the room. I was just a youngster they sort of tolerated, and all of of a sudden, time goes by, and before you know it, you're the only one on the ground. So it's pretty sobering.
Bob Scalapino wouldn't like to hear of this.
What was that,
He
Jen?
said Bob wouldn't like to hear of this early demise.
Bob Scalapino is just remarkable. He travels constantly and he writes with both hands at the same time. I don't know how he does it. And I owe him a lot because he was the intermediary between Dean Rusk at Rockefeller and the law school at Berkeley. He was heading the whole China operation at Berkeley, and his endorsement made what I was going to do look a little less irrational. Although the head of our China Center then, a very important economist of Chinese background, he thought I must be a fraud, because he said to me once at a cocktail party, "How do you spend your time?" He said, "You know, it's hard enough to get economic data about China, but there's nothing going on in the legal system in China." And he was implying I was sort of a fraud. And of course I could understand it, because it was pretty hard to show, especially once the Cultural Revolution started, that there was a functioning legal system in China, as Zhou Enlai himself was first to testify. It's funny about Zhou Enlai. When I go to places in China now, I'm frequently introduced by no other way than Professor Cohen met Zhou Enlai. The audience goes, "Oh." They don't say whether I talked to him for 4 hours or just shook his hand in passing the receiving line. But that's enough, given the enduring reputation of Zhou Enlai. It's impressive. And of course, some people who've tried to change that reputation have run into difficulty. But we have had some altering biographical details. But there was no doubt, whatever else the man did, he was the most charming dinner partner or host one could ever expect.
Last question, Jerry. From this extraordinary career, what lessons should we take home from your extraordinary career?
Study medicine. Steve has probably heard this before. When people ask me,
Not like I hadn't heard the other story.
Oh, sorry. You see, among my intimate group, we only talk in numbers. It's like the joke tellers convention.
I say, tell story 6A.
But you know, when Conrad Hilton, after 40 years in the hotel business, was asked a similar question, "What wisdom can you impart to the next generation?" He thought for a moment and he said, "Always keep the shower curtain inside the bathroom."
Well, that's the thing. I'll give you 1 minute for closing.
Say irrelevant or irreverent?
Irreverent, that's right, irreverent. But on behalf of the hundreds, I guess thousands of students you've now produced and put throughout this globe, you know, happy birthday.
Well, thank you.
Many more, and thank you for everything you've done.
I'm very touched by this occasion. Thank you.